This project has benefited from an annual grant from the Landscape Architecture Canada Foundation. I thank LACF for supporting this project. Also, a lot of thanks to those who supported my grant proposal and also the research participants who shared their experience for the study. So human beings are social creatures, and together we create societies. While our collective consciousness always existed in the forms of mythologies across cultures and our shared behaviors, but globalization in recent decades has actually made a mainstream society more apparent. So the mainstream society can also be called the hegemony, and it's considered a psychological and behavioral system based on historical and contemporary norms of patriarchy and related practices of colonialism, imperialism, capitalism, meritocracy, productivity, competition, empiricism, and rationality. So it's what our world runs by. From this dominant perspective, everything outside of the system does not exist. It just does not register. And what lives at its edges, in what we can see as the margins, in a logical sense, it's projected as marginalized. Usually we talk about that as race and others' identities, but for this context, I'm talking about anything that lives at the edges of the system. But what if we shift our place of focus? When we actually shift our place of focus, we are no longer seeing the margins. They don't exist anymore because we are at the center of another world. From this center, what was once dominant is now just another perspective amongst other worldviews. This perspective may have a greater force, but at the same time, it's still another perspective because at the margins, then there are lots of other perspectives. So if we were to place ourselves, the most authentic version of each of us in a diagram, where would you think we would be? Would the dominant system still be anyone's preferred home, or is it merely a legacy that we haven't yet learned to let go of? How much of that even matters if we moved again and stepped back to broaden our vision? From here, what is social, what is dominant, and what is marginal no longer matter. What remains is only the gratitude that you and I can coexist together within this vastness of space and time. So what if we looked at social change as an internal process of changing the place from where we see the world? This project explores this idea by using research as a way to initiate subconscious shifts in personal and collective perspectives. And the way I'm doing this is by taking mainstream research, which is a legacy of a patriarchal tradition, and turning it on its head. So instead of seeing research as a means to an end that leads us towards the goal of finding new knowledge, which is the way we traditionally think of what knowledge is for and what research is done, is by thinking that knowledge is something that we can attain and then use it for something else, I'm going backwards, like the game show Jeopardy. I already have the answer in mind, I guess you could say. So I use the research process as an unfolding experience to recover an intuitive knowing that we have forgotten or neglected to prioritize. So the end goal or the end knowledge is already set. It's the intention that I'm already setting in, and then I look at what is coming out of the process. This answer that I'm setting is that each person, each life story, and each life purpose is equally and intrinsically worthy. The system that I'm looking at is landscape architecture. I'll read out the abstract that I have for this project. Inspired by the Missing 32%, a gender equity initiative created by the AIA in 2012, this project explores the missing voices of women in landscape architecture. These voices are not found in statistics or equity campaigns, but in the act of giving space to the stories of women who have left, questioned their careers, or found alternative paths beyond the traditions of the profession. In a patriarchal society, what is deemed valuable feeds a cycle of normative conditions, but by seeking out the most unvaluable stories in the eyes of a wounded system, that is the neglected, mundane, or unorthodox, we make these stories invaluable and heal an old paradigm of conditional worthiness. So in terms of a profession, I would generally say the valuable aspect within the system would be success. We generally think of success in a profession is to be visible and to be heard, to be seen, and thriving in a very conventional way. So the unvaluable stories is outside of that definition of success. And it doesn't mean that the research participants part of this project aren't successful. It's that just from that perspective of leaving the profession, it's already outside of the definition of thriving within the profession. It's what I actually had originally wanted was to get women, because I'm contrasting this with patriarchy, those who have actually officially left the profession. But it was quite hard to find that specific pool of interview participants. And so what I've learned is expanding your pool, but keeping the important part of the research theme in place. So I expanded the research pool so that the parameters is that they graduated in landscape architecture and they either have left the profession or questioning their career paths within the profession, or they found an alternative path within a broader definition of landscape architecture. Here is a chart that explains the expansiveness of the participants in the pool. One participant was never a member of a landscape architecture association, and they never worked in the profession. There were two participants who were never members of the association, and they are currently working in adjacent professions such as urban planning. There are three participants who are currently inactive in the Landscape Architecture Association, and they currently don't work in the profession, but previously worked in traditional landscape design. There's one participant who is currently a full member, and they currently work in a specialized interdisciplinary role in the profession that is unique to their path and their career. And then they previously worked in traditional landscape design. And then lastly, the three other participants are currently full members, and they're currently working in traditional landscape design. And they have either been questioning their roles in their careers or have a career path of interest in the project themes. I didn't really introduce how my background is associated to this. I would say I am an undisclosed 11th participant, and I am called officially retired because in 2022, I did put into my association that I was in. Like I said, I'm leaving. They told me I was now considered retired. And for 8 years or so, I think I was inactive while I was doing my PhD. And I have worked in traditional landscape architecture. And in the time that I was inactive, I was doing graduate studies related to landscape and landscape architecture. And so if you looked at the elusiveness of what we think of leaving landscape architecture, then it gets to some rhetorical dilemmas. Number one is, how do we define being part of the profession of landscape architecture? There are legal requirements. The one is be a member of the professional association. This also includes a combination of requirements such as paying annual fees, an internship period, completing exams, in some cases doing continuing education, and employment if you're active. This could also include self-employment. In terms of the professional value that's related to success, we look at what defines success. And there's some mainstream values include fame and recognition, money, accomplishments, assets, knowledge, network, impact on others, and also joy. That is quite a broad range of things that are related to being successful in a professional setting. But if we look at the context of the participants and also those who don't fit into these definitions, including myself, then can these actual answers to being part of the profession and being successful be true, be absolute true? If you remember back to the first few slides I had with that, the world and the little world on the edges, you remembered that if we're standing right in the mainstream and looking out at the edges, it will always be on the margins. So what I wanted to do was to find a way to not do that, I guess. And so it's moving beyond representations. So what I'm looking at is not representing the margins as the margins from the center. So how do I do that is I had to set some parameters. They're intentional parameters. And this was also written in the fundings. So one is that this project recognizes that participants have agency in the choices they make for their lives and careers. They are neither victims nor superiors who need this project to advocate for their grievances or agendas. Qualitative research in the social sciences often have been motivated by researchers' desires to help and represent less privileged groups, which has historically led to conscious and subconscious power dynamics in the research process. And I would even say that many contemporary equity and social justice initiatives have inherited similar patterns, which subconsciously reinforces a narrative of marginalization on the self or on others, depending on where you put yourself and in comparison to the mainstream. which I call the mainstream as some sort of set lens of patriarchy. I acknowledge that landscape architecture is a relatively safe and protective system to even look at this shift in perspective, because if we're looking at all the people in the world, there are cases that this experimental way of shifting perception isn't really going to work. There's different needs in that way. So the other thing that I wanted to make sure the intention was that it goes the other way, that this project doesn't advocate on behalf of the profession for any agendas related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Because to focus on the needs of the system is also to prioritize the existing mainstream paradigm, which consequently also reinforces the dynamic of patriarchy and marginalization. So what am I doing with the information then? Because that's the usual way we do things. What I'm doing is actually working to shift a paradigm. Or the approach that I've been using is to look at two different aspects. One is to look at the parallels between gender inequality and the misplaced opportunities within landscape architecture from an archetypal perspective. And also, two, is that without any burdens of responsibility to represent, I simply receive the stories of the participants, their life experience as gifts, and I share them back so that we can become observers ready to learn and be inspired in whatever way we need to. I'm going to first talk about the first approach where I compare gender inequality versus landscape architecture as a system. And I think of this as landscape architecture as the self-aware system. To address the deeper psychological patterns, I look at archetypes. Generally, we think of archetypes as something very esoteric and dreamy and thought mythological, but I'm really looking at archetypes as very basic blocks of human relationality. In spiritual circles, people will talk about the oneness of the world, but most people aren't there, right? We're just looking at everything as separate things, separate people. So I'm looking at going back to the most common denominators. The Tao Te Ching from chapter 42 has a good way of looking at it. The Tao gives birth to the one gives birth to the two gives birth to the three, and the three gives birth to the 10,000 things. So if I'm going back to the most common denominator, before the one, there's the two. And we actually understand that too because we know relationships. So everything in the universe starts with the unity of the dualities in a relationship. Very simple ones, light and shadow, we know. Ones and zeros in a computer binary system. And even in science, the quantum particle is able to be at two places at the same time before it is observed. So there's a lot of those dualities in our universe. So nature is the balance of the feminine and the masculine from an archetypal, energetic, and creative sense. Humans are nature. So we have a balance of feminine and masculine. And this isn't to be conflated with biological classifications of men and women and historical gender roles. So you can use different names if you do not like to relate it to feminine and masculine. In different cultures, there are different names to explain this. The feminine is known similarly in Taoism as yin, in Carl Jung's psychoanalytic theory as the anima, Shakti in Hinduism, and Gaia in ancient Greek. And the qualities are receptivity, intuition, flow, nature, embodiment, and groundedness. The masculine side is also known similarly in Taoism as the yang, Carl Jung psychoanalytic theory as animus, Shiva in Hinduism, and Uranus in ancient Greek. And the qualities are action, reason, structure, protecting, doing, and envisioning. How this relates to landscape is that landscape is actually quite sacred and existential because it's the meeting ground between two primary existential dynamics. One is the external union between sky and earth, so Uranus and Gaia, Father Sky and Mother Earth. And it's also the internal mediator between inside and outside, between our perception of the world and what we make sense of. You could think of it either way, whether we perceive the world from inside and we make sense of it on the outside, or what we perceive outside and what we make sense of internally. It's like this void between across. And the interesting thing I found that I've been noticing, even in myself, is that we often refer to nature as she, so Mother Nature. But I've been working to correct myself in that Mother Earth is still Mother Earth, but there's a lot of nature that comes from the sky. If we think of like Father Sky, then when we group everything in nature as the feminine, there's a real big imbalance there. And I don't know how much that is a contribution to patriarchy, but I think that there is some sort of imbalancing in our way of seeing nature. What happens when we mistake balancing duality with binary splitting, so splitting between nature and culture, men and women, and whatever ways else you want to split things. To get into two categories. One is nature worshiping or nature bypassing. So we either see nature or external nature as something that's better than humans or more sacred than humans, and something that we can use as a way of healing without actually looking back into ourselves. And then there's also the nature rejection, not focusing on the body, very much focused on thinking and the mind, and our examples of technology where it's disembodied outside of ourselves. That's also a way of nature rejection. And both of these are forms of denying human nature. And the collective imbalance of human nature at a societal level becomes patriarchy. From an archetypal sense, I call patriarchy the wounded father archetype, or the manifestation of the wounded father archetype. The thing about the wounded father is the fear of vulnerability, and you'd see it as a weakness. So to cope with the threat of disempowerment, he finds justification to marginalize another by dismissing and denying the value of a person, group, or idea. But since vulnerability in a human sense is about susceptibility to pain, loss, and death, it's all part of nature. So patriarchy is a state that's created out of a psychological error, or in other words, a false belief. And I want to be clear that it's not about men and women or father and mother, because there's always a connection. Where there is a wounded father, always exists a wounded mother. Distorted feminine and distorted masculine come together. And these distortions set the foundation for a lot of the issues that we have in society, at least according to my philosophy. One is hierarchical civilizations, examples, colonialism, imperialism, caste-based systems. Those other types of civilizations that we have, which I call ideological civilizations, such as communism, religion, state, and capitalism, aren't really patriarchal in theory, but if you've already set up our human relationships that way, then they're always doomed to be failures, and they always take the distortion into the system. And then there's other things that gets adapted into society, such as undervaluing traditional wisdom practiced by women and the objectification of women, denouncing the authority of nature by seeing it as resources, and seeing nature as inanimate objects, which develops a one-way relationship with the natural world. And seeing the natural world as having less value and less intelligence than humans. The other thing is devaluing earth-based cultures and spiritual practices. One pet peeve that I have is also dismissing the power of Mother Earth and projecting a damsel in distress narrative to alleviate human responsibility to the planet, such as the Save the Earth slogans. Because the Earth itself doesn't need to be saved. It's our shared home and ourselves and other animals and species that needs to be saved because of our own behaviors. Having the imbalance creates pain, and to maintain it, you need to distract ourselves from the pain. So we have emotional distractions such as overfixing on intellectualism, technology, and status, and also numbing through addictions, guilt-inducing pleasures, and blaming each other. But I see that landscape architecture is the perfect profession to hold space for a paradigm shift because it is archetypally balanced in theory. We have structure building, creativity, empathy for others, and relating to the Earth's processes. And also, one thing that I found pretty unique to landscape architecture is the vulnerability in its professional identity. And that gives it the space to examine itself with its own patriarchy. The vulnerability comes from the juxtaposition of its noble cause with the insecurity in comparison to related professions. I think that most people who have been trained in landscape architecture would know about how it's often that we compare to architecture or much glamorous or more recognized professions. Oftentimes we think that this is a bad thing, but in my case, I think that this vulnerability, this instability of the professional identity kind of gives it room that it doesn't build too much of an ego, I guess you could say. That gives that room to examine itself. So I took the Canadian Landscape Charter principles and tweaked them to show how the paradigm shift could happen related to how this project goals work. So recognizing landscapes as vital, I've looked at it as to contribute to the healing of our society's wounded relationship with nature. And then considering all people is to look back into the system itself to radically consider all people affected by its own system, even those who have left. Then inspiring stewardship is to inspire a holistic approach as a profession, Expanding knowledge is to not only expand knowledge, but also break through outdated paradigms. And then showing leadership is to show a new kind of leadership to the world that is embodied and not just talk. Transcending the binary between nature and culture is already the essence of landscape work. If you remember what I talked about landscape and how it's the intersection of two primary dualities. In landscape, you don't need to even try because it's already in there that nature and culture is already transcended. So ironically, there is no need for landscape architecture to be better leaders in the eyes of society because a quiet, sacred, and embodied leadership role is already built into the essence of landscape architecture. But amidst the profession's concerns for self-advocacy in comparison to the dominant system, such as legislative stature, social political value, and technological advancements, can landscape architects still recognize their spiritual role? For me, I'm just putting this out there because, for one, I'm not in the profession anymore, so I don't really have a stake in this. But I do have some reflection questions for you if you want to bring this forward. So one is, how often do you connect with the spirit of the place? We learn in school about that, but does that actually translate to practice? And does that translate to everyday activity, like seeing and feeling the place as itself rather than the analysis that we put into it? And this goes on to the second one, is how often do we listen to the intuition for what a place needs, what users are not saying or saying between the lines, and what higher wisdom the flora and fauna of the project site has for you? I really mean this beyond site analysis. It's really listening to the place as something that can give us back wisdom and knowledge and that kind of stuff. And lastly, how often do you trust your gut, honor your own emotions, and respect your vulnerability in the workplace and when making career decisions? This has to also relate to the environment we're in. So are these ways of relating to the feminine archetype and to your own nature supported through your education, workplace, and professional body? This way of being is actually what I refer to in the title as the passive voice. And unlike the active voice, which is characterized by business, action, and intensity of being seen and heard, the power of the passive voice is actually found in listening and receiving. And this kind of leads us to the interview participants. What I do is phenomenological research, which is really about studying experience, so how we live, exist in the world and live our lives. But I like to call it constellations because I found that it's the best word to describe what I feel I get out of this type of research. This sounds really basic, but I recently in this year found out that the stars in the sky in constellations are at various distances from each other. So we see them as like sort of like a plane in the sky, but they're all over the place. All we're seeing is a pattern from our perspective. They're all by themselves somewhere out in the universe. And I feel like that's the same thing when we talk about people. Everybody is a single person somewhere else, but as a group, we have a shared story or a shared pattern that we can look at. So I have taken the quotes from the interviews, and together I think they suggest a shared journey of growing through and beyond landscape architecture. But in each quote, there's a fully spirited human being. So I suggest for you to learn from these women in whatever way you want and how they have grown as human beings as they learn from their suffering, follow their passions, surrender to life, entertain their imaginative fancies, become humbled by their vulnerabilities, question their purpose, allow themselves to be touched by the connections, and open their hearts. And hopefully, when we can see a woman in her fullness, we can also see any person, species, being, place, and experience in fullness as well. I've put together the quotes into themes, and this is the list. So ambivalent beginnings, big dreams and learned pragmatism, bursted bubbles, internal and external challenges, beyond the box, searching for purpose, doses of reality, gender politics, rural motherhood, acceptance, confidence, and self-stewardship, love of work, landscape architecture, and beyond, beautiful connections, being inspired and supporting others. This rundown of the theme starts at the beginning of landscape architecture, like landscape architecture education. And the way I had formed the questions were like that. Let's look back at the beginning of how you started in landscape architecture. And then it's almost like chronological through the ages. Lots of things that happen in the participants' lives. So it's a growing process. I find when I do this research, this one and also when I did my PhD, was the idea of names, because traditional qualitative research is usually not using people's names just to protect their privacy. But when we talk about the names in a professional setting, sometimes people want their names to be associated with a project. And there's a little dilemma there. To me, it has to be all or nothing. It's that everybody is either their names are there or we don't put them for anybody. So I found that it's always the case that I say it's nameless. And I want to relate that back to landscape because last month I went to do a pilgrimage, I would call, of some of the projects that I worked on as a landscape architect. And I found that in there was also a newfound appreciation for the namelessness of the people who call themselves landscape architects. So what I was thinking of was actually going to these places and seeing if I could reclaim parts of myself. But I found was this appreciation for knowing that there was lots of people involved in the project who were not, in no way we can find their names associated with, well, these were all projects that I did, but I'm just extrapolating to all landscapes, is that there's no way of getting the names. And unlike architecture or visual arts, where your name is not necessary in architecture all the time, but it's much easier to have your name associated with a building or even in a magazine or something like that. In landscapes, it's almost like you're letting go of the name in order to let the landscape speak for itself. When I practice, I also got teary when I was talking about this part, and I also feel it kind of coming out, the emotions, is that there's something really sacred about that, to let the landscape speak for itself. And that in itself is there's something sacred in that nameless contribution of people in the profession. And in tandem to this, I realized that part of the once abandoned self-worth of my youth was also in that part. Because I had thought that I was going to retrieve parts of myself, but I found that I was actually retrieving parts of myself that I myself had abandoned because I had subscribed to a set of criteria for what it means to be successful. And going back to these places actually really, sorry, I'm getting emotional, really gets me rethinking about the past that I had abandoned. And so to conclude, I would have to say that there's no landscape architecture, no knowledge production, and no social change without humans. So can we really hear someone if we haven't fully learned to listen to ourselves? Can we really appreciate nature if we can't appreciate our own nature? Can we really be inclusive if we aren't accepting all parts of ourselves? And can we create place for someone if we haven't yet understood our own place in the world? And the answer to this is always reciprocal because the extent of what we can hold space for externally is what we can hold space for internally. So, in my opinion, landscape work is not just product making. And I go beyond talking about landscape architecture. I'm saying landscape in general, any work related to that. To me, it's also a process of creating the human being we want to become. So, this last slide, I'm going to go and take a stab at the rhetorical question that I originally started off with. That is when, why, or what. I'm just going to group that together. Does it mean to leave landscape architecture? And what does it mean to be successful in landscape architecture? And from the research, is that there is really no answer. There are disappointments, I'd say, for many people, and there are also a lot of love for landscape architecture. When we talk about leaving or not leaving, it really came down to the flow of life and the decisions that people had to make for that particular case. And so my answer is following the flow of life and accepting its process. But there is something that comes to mind near the end of the project that really stuck out to me was passion over purpose, purpose over profession.